Welcome, everybody, to another episode of JewishDream.com, the podcast, video, the show. Today, Professor Adam Teller, who is Professor of History, Professor of Judaic Studies at Brown University, is joining us. And for those who listened to the earlier episode with Professor Glenn Dinner talking about 18th and 19th century Jewish tavern keepers in Poland, Professor Teller here has done earlier work, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Awesome.
Also 18th century, but earlier too.
18th and earlier?
Yeah.
Let's start with this. Was there much difference between the 18th century and 17th century in sort of the, whether it's the socioeconomics or the involvement in the Jews, whether as tavern keepers or elsewhere in the liquor trade in Poland?
Yeah, it gets much more intensive in the 18th century. Many more Jews make their living out of it and move out of the towns into the villages. So that's what happened in the 18th century, and Professor Dinner will tell you what happened in the 19th century, but that's a whole new thing as the structure of the country around the Jews changes, so the tavern keeping changes. But that's his expertise, and I'm not going to take that away from him.
What were some of those changes moving from the 17th to the 18th century that prompted them in that direction?
Well, really the Jewish tavern keeping initiative begins in the late 16th and 17th centuries. It's part of a huge change in the Polish economy that the Jews take a part in. Poland becomes an exporter of grain. It grows a lot more grain. It develops a whole new feudal system in order to make that work. And the Jews enter that system, first of all, as businessmen. They lease estates and they run them for noblemen. But in doing that, they take over the niche of selling alcohol in order to make a profit, first for themselves and then for the noblemen. And slowly they move into the sale of alcohol as a major Jewish occupation. First of all, in Ukraine, which is incredibly rich agricultural region, but then the rest of Poland too. That's how it begins. What happens is that you see Jews moving into the villages where they sell alcohol on behalf of the noblemen. Each tavern is a part of a noble monopoly on the sale of alcohol, and the Jews lease that monopoly, which means that the peasants have to drink in the Jewish taverns. There isn't really anywhere else for them to drink. And sometimes,
really?
Yeah, and sometimes
So,
go on.
It really is a monopoly that the nobility have, and they put the tavern keepers as Jews pretty much.
Yeah, well, it actually works. It's slightly different. The Jews lease the whole estates, and then the leaseholders put in cousins, brothers, friends, right? They get them in to run the taverns for them. But they're running it in the name of the nobleman.
Okay. That's amusing. Okay. So but it was semi-monopolistic, like quasi-monopolistic, like it was mostly the Jews operating as tavern keepers?
Yes, well, in the villages, the Jews owned the only taverns and the peasants had to drink there. And drinking was the major leisure activity of Polish and Ukrainian peasants in the 17th, 18th century. There was not much else to do in a village out there.
Wow.
So,
can I go back?
Yeah.
Was there much difference in the agricultural aspects in Poland versus the Ukraine? Was it mostly the grains that they were utilizing? Was it mostly rye? Was it?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it's not a huge distinction in what's being grown. But the feudal system that works it is much more dominant in the Ukraine as far as the Jews are concerned. And the Jews, as they enter this new way of making a living, this causes issues for them as Jews. So, for example, if you own the only tavern in the village or in the region, right, a number of villages, and you're closed on Shabbat because you're Jewish, your clients are not going to be at all happy about that,
right?
And you're a monopoly holder, so it has to be open. So, in fact, in that period, you have a whole range of issues to do with how to keep Shabbat and be a tavern keeper, right? Who you can sell on credit to. Sometimes you have to close the tavern. Other times you sell some alcohol to a non-Jew and he will sell it for you, right?
Yeah.
But you have to do that before Shabbat and buy it back after Shabbat, right? And Jews too buy alcohol. Alcohol drinking Jews do too. They don't generally drink to excess like the peasants do, but they certainly drink. And they will come on a Friday night and they'll want some beer for the evening or some vodka. And they also want to buy, so they have to work out a credit system so that Jews can buy alcohol. It's a very complicated business.
So it sounds like there's a lot of self-navigation that the Jews had to do vis-a-vis the tavern keeping. How much did they consult rabbinic authorities on these matters?
It really worked the other way around. The rabbinic authorities were trying to tell the Jewish tavern keepers what to do. Right?
Okay.
Right, and depending on the tavern keeper, they did or they didn't. Right, there are plenty of evidence that there were tavern keepers who really didn't keep Shabbat, or they would take money but have a handkerchief in their hand. Right, so they're not actually touching the money. Right?
That's a clever workaround.
It's a workaround anyway. So yes, so
that's definitely
those Jews in the villages were not highly regarded at all. They were one of the lowest classes of Jewish society. They also lived a long way from a town, so there's no yeshiva. You can't send your kids; don't get a proper education, right? You yourself, they come into town for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and that's about it, right? So they're not very. They might be observant, but they're not highly. What's the word?
Regarded
and engaged in communal life.
You mentioned earlier beer. So in addition to the vodka, right? I guess it was rye-based vodka. Do they have some sort of rye-based beer also?
Yeah, that's right. Those were the two main things that were made. In fact, in many places, particularly in the towns, the Jews also were in charge of making the beer and the vodka.
Oh yeah.
They would run the breweries and they'd run the distilleries. Usually, they had non-Jews working for them.
Okay.
But that would be part of the deal, part of what they'd leased. They would make the beer and they'd sell it.
So it was a similar arrangement to the tavern keeping where they had leases with the nobility?
Yes, it's all done through leases, either directly with the nobility or indirectly through a Jewish leaseholder.
Now, how did it happen, or why did it happen that the Jews were the ones with the leases, both with regards to the selling as well as the production and presumably the trade in these beverages?
Well, the nobility in Poland was at loggerheads with the townspeople. They were two competing powers within the state, right?
Really?
Yeah. It was a battle that the nobility won out with very easily and very early. But they did not want to support the Christian townspeople in getting wealthy or getting more powerful. They looked for a different part of society that would enable them to make the economic choices that they wanted without employing townspeople. And the Jews were very, very much a key player there. They helped the nobility undercut the townspeople in all kinds of ways. So when the nobility were looking for economic agents to lease their estates and to run the taverns, the Jews were a natural choice. There was a kind of partnership. I mean, it's not equal partnership because the nobility and the Jews are, not well regarded by the nobility either. But it's still a partnership, right? Where the Jews are providing economic services to the nobility that the nobility really want and need.
It makes sense for them, and obviously they have the power leverage. But what was the cause of the sort of the rift between the Polish nobility and then the regular townsfolk? Like, what was?
It goes back to the very structure of society. There are usually three main forces in an early modern society. You have a king, you have a nobility, and you have the towns. In Poland, the king is getting weaker. And the nobility is getting stronger, and the nobility buttresses its position by keeping the townspeople weak. In Central Europe, the towns get much stronger, and the nobility aren't as strong. So it's a kind of different array of powers in different places. But in Poland, it's very much the nobility on the rise, and the townspeople are kept low. And the Jews are an agent in that political struggle.
Wow.
An economic agent, not a political agent, obviously.
Yeah. Wow, that's really fascinating. And how did it even? I don't know, how was there an articulated decision-making process in getting, when did that happen? Which century did the Jews start getting involved in whether the production or the distribution of?
It starts in the second half of the 17th century.
Okay.
Poland annexes Ukraine in about 1569, and then divides it up into parcels of land which are given to noblemen. And from then on, they're leasing out the land, and then Jews come, take the big leases, and then set out small tavern leases, and other Jews come. So in about 1569, you've got 2,000 or 3,000 Jews in Ukraine. By the time you get to 1648, you've got 40,000, 50,000. So it's a big moment of growth for Jews in Ukraine.
Did that also create some societal friction with all the increase of Jews into the Ukraine?
It does do eventually. The Jews are initially, serving the nobility, right? And so this gives them a certain amount of power and a certain amount of protection.
Okay.
However, as time goes on, the Polish occupation of Ukraine becomes much more brutal, and the Jews are identified as agents of this brutal regime. And so a whole lot of tension grows up between them and peasants and townspeople in Ukraine. And that will come to a head in the Khmelnytsky uprising of 1648, what the Jews called Gzerot Tachvatat, which was a major uprising in which many thousands of Jews were killed and communities destroyed.
And that was mostly in the Ukraine, not the other part of Poland, right?
No, the Khmelnytsky uprising was in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
In Ukraine.
And so what's the aftermath, more broadly speaking, in the Ukraine part for the Jews there?
Well, what happens is the Jews prove incredibly resilient. So communities are destroyed and many thousands die. Many more flee and then come back when peace breaks out. The nobility want to reconstruct their estates.
Okay.
And the Jews play a key role in that process of reconstruction, which enables them not just to return to the positions they held before, but in fact to deepen their economic activity in Ukraine. They become more engaged in the Ukrainian economy as you move into the 17th and 18th centuries.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So it increased. Okay.
Yeah.
And so then I would imagine that applies broadly economically, but also in our specific conversation about tavern keeping and production and sale of alcohol as well.
Yes, exactly. More and more Jews find their ways out to the taverns. Also because the nobility begin to squeeze the peasants. The nobility, the monopoly on alcohol is a significant part of the noble income. In the 18th century, when Poland begins to decline, the importance of that income becomes greater. And so the nobility want to squeeze it. They build more taverns, right? They push the sale of alcohol harder. The Jews do the hard work for them, right?
Yeah.
And so you find more and more taverns, more and more Jews, right? And Jews become more engaged in that activity.
Wow, that's incredible. That they're really trying to squeeze more out.
Yeah. By the
I mean,
time
it's
you
their
get
moneymaker.
by the time you get to the late 18th century, Poland has a problem of alcoholism in the villages. And they've squeezed to that extent that it's become a social problem. For which the Jews are blamed, always. The Jews are, because they're doing the selling on the ground, they're the people who get blamed for it. Although it's a structural part of the noble economy. But the Jews are the figureheads.
Yes. Yep. They're the ones up front. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, always. If we go backwards in time, what was the historical context before the rise of these tavern keeping? And this vodka wasn't always around, right? Was there something that preceded it? As far as beverages, I imagine they had some sort of rye-based beer.
Yeah, well, you have what the main beverages that they would sell were beer, mead, which is a kind of sweet wine,
honey.
Yeah, honey, and vodka, and this develops. That economy develops very strong in the 16th century, but it didn't start in the 16th century. Previously, the noblemen had either had townspeople or peasants running taverns, but they weren't terribly efficient. They were on fixed contracts. The rents were hard to put up. And so when you see the beginning of the movement in Poland and in Ukraine, they get rid of the non-Jewish tavern keepers as much as they can and put Jews in because they're on rolling contracts, right? Okay. You can make them pay more over time.
Huh. Yeah.
And of course, the Jewish tavern keeper passes that on to his customers, so that the prices go up. It's a system that actually initially sort of makes the economy more efficient, right? Until it passes a tipping point, at which point it's squeezing an economy that isn't growing enough.
Yeah. Wow. I imagine there's also probably, especially in the Ukraine, with the Gentile tavern keepers being pushed out in favor of the Jewish ones, there would also be some resentment there too.
Not terribly, to be honest. That doesn't seem to have, at least as far as the material that I've seen, doesn't seem to arouse a lot of tension.
Okay.
I think possibly the few that are selling alcohol is not a big enough number, right, to cause a social problem. The numbers come when the Jews begin to, they make it an economic niche that is Jewish. In fact, in Polish in that period, the word lessee, right, arendaj, means a Jewish tavern keeper, right?
Wow.
So the Jews make it their own, and that's when it becomes more efficient initially, and then a problem after that.
Wow. What? Why? What? I'm going to go in a different direction. You mentioned earlier that the Polish nobility really squeezed through the increase in prices on the tavern keeping and their taxes.
It was more than that.
Why was it such a big driver of revenue? What else do they have available?
Well, Poland is essentially, it's an agricultural economy. Ukraine particularly, because very rich agricultural land. In the earlier period, until the Khmelnytsky uprising, a lot of grain was exported. And what wasn't exported was sold on the home market either as flour or a lot of it as alcohol. You move into the later period, that export market collapses. Right? Central Europe begins to reorganize its own economy following 1648, which is the Peace of Westphalia. So the Central European economy becomes stronger. They don't need to import grain anymore. Poland has grain surpluses that it needs to do something with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's sort of driving that.
So it's the grain surplus that drives them to basically reinvest it into the alcohol trade.
Yes, that's right. They push the alcohol trade as a way of soaking up agricultural production.
Wow. Okay. And so that was the latter half of the 17th century. And then going into the 18th century, it got more Jews were involved in the tavern keeping?
The Jewish involvement becomes greater and the squeezing becomes greater. That's the process that goes through the 18th century.
Right. And
it also means that the connections between the Jews and the noblemen become stronger. Particularly, there's a very small group of very rich noblemen that are known as magnates, right? And they are run, by the time you get to the 18th century, they're running the show and they have Jews in their employ. Huge numbers of Jews. I mean, I did research on the business records of one of these great magnate families. And in the business records, you can't turn a page without finding a Jewish businessman of some sort or another. Right? They are so dominant.
Wow. Okay, that's really cool. What else should I be asking? Anything else you want to?
Well, yeah. Well, a couple of things you can talk about, I think, is first of all, we said that the Jews living in the taverns in the towns are not highly regarded by the Jewish communities, but they are actually part of the social fabric of Polish village life. The Jews are deeply engaged in the Polish agricultural economy. Right? I think it's one of the first few times that the Jews are really dealing in agriculture. I mean, not productive agriculture, but the agricultural economy since the destruction of the Second Temple. Honestly, I think you don't see that depth of Jewish engagement in agriculture. I mean, there are always Jewish farmers and Jewish doing this, but this is like a major Jewish occupation. And I think But it also means that the Jews are part of the social fabric of the villages. So that the Jewish tavern keeper, although he's always a stranger, he's also a friend, right? You would drink at his tavern, he would know who you were, you'd know who he was, right? There's always tension because it's Christians and Jews, but on the other hand, daily life is as strong as it is, right? And so he's just another guy, and they talk to each other. They know the language. They talk to each other, right? And so that's another way that the Jews become really deeply involved in the social fabric of the country. The tavern keeping really takes them right down. We do see cases of Jewish tavern keepers and non-Jewish serving girls having relationships, Jewish girls, and but this does. It's not a huge phenomenon, but you see it happening. But in fact, eventually, you can't think of a Polish village without its Jewish tavern keeper. Right? And in the 19th century, and then Glenn Presedina will be telling you about that. It's a trope in Polish literature of the Polish village with its Jewish tavern keeper.
Oh, really? What did they talk about in the sort of the broader Polish literature about the Jewish tavern keepers?
Well, it depends who was writing. I mean, sometimes it just be mentioned. Sometimes the Jew could be a sinister character. But in the most, I don't know if Professor Dina mentioned it, but in the most famous Polish poem of the 19th century, Pan Tadeusz, or one of the most famous, the Jewish tavern keeper called Yankel, right, is a major figure in Polish resistance to the Russian occupation. He becomes a folk hero, right?
Wow.
But that's Professor Dina's territory. I'm not going to move into there. But yeah, so it really becomes part of who Poland. What Poland is the Jewish tavern. Now the taverns themselves were not at all salubrious. We have visitors reports, right? Travelers who they tend to be very dirty, very smelly, right? Not very well appointed.
Yeah.
Rather revolting places, but that's what there was. I mean, those were the places where you stayed.
So they were both a drinking establishment, probably food, as well as lodging. You're saying?
Right. Yes. Very often, if you're traveling through either a town or a small town, shtetl, right, the Jewish tavern will be the place where you can put up.
Can I ask a really far back question, which is, how did you get started onto this topic, researching and, of course, publishing on it?
The very first time I went to Poland, which was in the mid-1980s, I had a very strong intuitive sense that this is a very, very Jewish place.
Really?
Yeah. There wasn't much to be seen, to be honest. I mean, I saw what I could see, but I had a kind of intuitive sense this is a really Jewish place, and I need to explore that Jewishness. What is the Jewishness of Poland?
Oh, right? Wow. Yeah.
And that took me on a long journey that, among other places, brought me to the small taverns in the small towns of Ukraine and Poland. And Poland was a highly, highly Jewish place.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Hard for us to imagine. I mean, the Holocaust took that away.
Wow.
You really can't imagine modern Jewish history without Polish Jews. They are such an integral and key part of that history.
Wow.
It's just the tavern keepers. The tavern keepers are one part of a much broader society, but I find that fascinating. They're also a highly creative group. They're a very vibrant, creative group, and that also is really attractive. The other thing that is true, and is very attractive, is that there is no history of Poland without the history of the Jews. You can't imagine Polish history without the Jews. People try, right? But it can't be done because they're playing such key roles in the economy and they're so deeply engaged in society. Even as they are strangers and hated for their religion, they are deeply enmeshed in society. And so you can't think of Poland from the 17th, 18th century without thinking about the Jews. And today in Poland, more and more historians are coming to that conclusion, that they need to understand the Jewish aspect of their history.
Wow. So I imagine people growing up nowadays, or even the last few decades, really don't have the same sense of what happened in the, before mid 20th century. It was such a huge break from the previous centuries of Polish existence, right?
Yeah, that it came really with the fall of communism in the late 80s. Jewish issues, the Jewish Party of Polish history became part of the revision of Poland that the opponents of communism wanted to make. And so it was that generation that really began to explore it. Because under communism, things were much more frozen and the past attitudes didn't go away. It was really only when communism passed and the Solidarity, for example, members of Solidarity were very interested in Jewish issues, right? Even as they were also among them anti-Semites. It's the two go together.
Wow.
But I was there in the 80s, and members of Solidarity, I mean, usually students, not senior members, would talk to me, and they're absolutely clear that this was for them really, really important.
Wow.
It was a part of their history that had been taken away from them, and they wanted it back.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating. Yeah. Professor Teller, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on 17th and 18th century Polish tavern keepers who were Jews. And this was really great. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.